You know what fascinates me most about this whole debate? It's not whether capitalism works or whether socialism works. It's that we're still asking the wrong question. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through why the humanity of any economic system isn't found in its intentions, but in its actual results, and why the greatest moral danger comes not from those who pursue profit, but from those absolutely convinced of their own righteousness. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll discover why the system you've been taught to question might actually be the only one that truly respects human dignity and individual freedom. So, before we dive in, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because understanding this distinction between intentions and outcomes could fundamentally change how you view freedom, responsibility, and the society you want to live in. The great reversal. When everyone stopped arguing about efficiency, let me tell you something that should shock you. It should absolutely shake the foundations of everything you think you know about this debate. The argument has completely changed. When I was a young economist, and believe me, that was quite some time ago, the debate between capitalism and socialism was fought on the grounds of efficiency. The socialists argued that centralized planning, government control of production and distribution, would be more efficient than the chaotic free market. They claimed that rational scientific planning from the center would eliminate waste, eliminate duplication, eliminate the disorder of competition. And you know what? Nobody makes that argument anymore. Nobody. You want to know why? Because the evidence is overwhelming, it's undeniable, it's staring us right in the face. Look at Great Britain with its nationalized industries struggling, inefficient, a fraction of the productivity of private enterprise. Look at Russia, the great socialist experiment that was supposed to usher in a worker's paradise. And what do you find? Long lines for bread, shortages of basic goods, an economy that can barely feed its own people despite vast natural resources. And right here at home, look at our own post office. How many of you have had the pleasure, and I use that word ironically, of dealing with government bureaucracy at its finest? But here's what truly fascinates me. Here's the puzzle that keeps me up at night. If nobody seriously argues anymore that socialism is more efficient, if the evidence so clearly demonstrates that market economies outperform centrally planned ones, why is there still such widespread opposition to capitalism? Why do intellectuals, smart people, educated people, people who should know better, continue to embrace some vague notion of collectivism while rejecting the very system that has produced unprecedented prosperity? Let me give you the most dramatic example I know. Germany. Think about this for a moment. Here was a nation that experienced the absolute horror of Nazi totalitarianism in the 1930s. They lived through it. They suffered under it. They saw firsthand what happens when the state controls everything. Then, after the war, under Ludwig Erhard's policy of Soziale-Marktwirtschaft, the social market economy, Germany experienced what can only be called an economic miracle. Income soared, living standards exploded, ordinary people prospered in ways that would have seemed impossible just years before. You would think, you would naturally assume, that Germans would embrace capitalism with open arms. But what do we find? A large fraction of German intellectuals, those who write for newspapers, who appear on television, who shape public opinion, remain fundamentally anti-capitalist. Some have gone to extremes that you've read about in the papers, the terrorists. But even among the mainstream intellectuals, there's this persistent, almost visceral opposition to free markets. Why? What produces this attitude? Now, there's a Russian dissident mathematician named Igor Shafarevich, who wrote an essay that's never been published in Russia, naturally, but appears in English in a book called From Under the Rubble, edited by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And Shafarevich makes a fascinating, disturbing argument. He traces the appeal of socialism back thousands of years and concludes that just as Freud identified a death wish in individuals, the opposition to capitalism represents a kind of death wish for society itself, particularly among intellectuals. It's a strange, almost unbelievable interpretation. But I urge you to read it because it makes far more sense than it has any right to. But I think there's a simpler explanation. And it has everything to do with what we're discussing here today. The opposition to capitalism comes from a combination of emphasis on moral values, which sounds wonderful, doesn't it? And profound ignorance about the relationship between moral values and economic systems. You see, the people emphasizing these moral values are almost always people who don't have economic problems themselves. It's not the masses demanding socialism, it's comfortable intellectuals who've never missed a meal. Here's the fundamental mistake they make. They try to judge entire systems, capitalism, socialism, central planning, as if systems themselves can be moral or immoral, humane or inhumane. But that's nonsense. Moral values are individual, not collective. They have to do with what each of us separately believes, what each of us holds true in our own hearts. These economic systems, they're means, not ends. They're tools, mechanisms, methods of organization. In themselves, they're neither moral nor immoral, neither humane nor inhumane. What we must ask is, what are their results? What are their actual consequences? And this is where we have to look beneath the surface. We can't just listen to what proponents of different systems say about their intentions. Beautiful intentions, noble goals, stirring speeches about equality and justice, these mean nothing if the actual results go the other way. Socialism appeals to high-minded people because of its supposed objectives: equality, social justice, uplifting the downtrodden. These are fine objectives. It's a tribute to good people that these goals appeal to them. But does the system actually produce these results? Once you look at the evidence, it's crystal clear that it does not. Where are social injustices greatest? Where do you find the most torture, the most incarceration, the most oppression of human beings? In countries with central control. The social injustice in Russia is of an entirely different order of magnitude than in Western countries where we've grown up regarding freedom as our birthright. Yugoslavia, which is far more benign than Russia, still imprisons writers like Milovan Djilas for publishing a book. China has murdered thousands simply for opposing the government. This is the reality of centralized power, claiming to pursue justice. And what about equality, that golden promise of socialism? Where do you find the greatest inequality? In the socialist states. I remember about 15 years ago, I was in Moscow with my wife. We were walking with our tourist guide, and I spotted these fancy Russian limousines, Zivs they were called, sort of a knockoff of 1938 American Packards. Out of curiosity, I asked our guide, "How much do those sell for?" She looked at it and said, "Oh, those aren't for sale. Those are only for members of the Politburo. You have this tiny elite with all the services and amenities of life, while vast masses live at desperately low standards. Even the wage ratio between foremen and ordinary workers in the Soviet Union is greater than in the United States." I'm reminded of a remarkable man we met in Warsaw, Edward Lipinski. He was in his 70s when we met him, a lifelong socialist who had spent decades believing in the cause. And you know, it's hard, it's incredibly difficult for someone to question their lifelong beliefs in their later years. But Lipinski said something I'll never forget. "I used to believe in socialism, I still do, but socialism is an ideal. We can't have it in the real world until we're rich enough to afford it. Socialism will be practical when every man in Poland has a house and 2 servants." I couldn't resist. I asked him, including the servants. He smiled and said, "Yes, the truth about self-interest and human dignity." Now let me talk to you about capitalism and why it repels so many people, because this is crucial to understanding the whole debate. Capitalism is a system based on private property and voluntary exchange. That's it. That's the core. And it has driven people away because they think it emphasizes self-interest in a narrow, selfish way. They're repelled by the idea of people pursuing their own interests rather than some broader, more noble purpose. But, and this is critical, when you look at the actual results, they point in exactly the opposite direction. It's in capitalist societies, only where capitalism has prevailed over sustained periods, that you find both freedom and prosperity together. Look at the Western countries where freedom prevails: the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, Western Europe, Australia, increasingly Japan today. Yes, we all have our defects. No system is perfect. But can anyone seriously deny that we enjoy far greater individual and personal freedom than most other places in the world? And simultaneously, this is key, the ordinary person enjoys greater prosperity, greater opportunity, more social justice, and less inequality than anywhere else. So here's the question we must ask. Has socialism failed because evil men perverted its good qualities? Was it just bad luck that Stalin took over from Lenin? Has capitalism succeeded despite the supposedly immoral values at its core? I believe the answer to both questions is no. Each system has been true to the values it encourages and develops in the people who live under it. Now, when we talk about moral values in this context, we're concerned with relations between people. It's important to distinguish between two things: the morality relevant to each of us in our private lives, how we individually conduct ourselves, and what's relevant to systems of government, which is how we organize relations between people. And here's what I believe is the fundamental value in human relations. It's not to do good to others whether they want you to or not. It's not to force people to do what you think is good for them. The fundamental value is to respect the dignity and individuality of your fellow human beings, to treat them not as objects to be manipulated for your purposes, but as persons with their own values, their own rights, people to be persuaded, not coerced, not forced, not bulldozed, not brainwashed. Here's something that might surprise you in all systems, whether you call them socialism, capitalism, or anything else. People act from self-interest. The citizens of Russia act from self-interest in exactly the same way as citizens of the United States. The difference is in what determines self-interest. A foreman in an American factory worries about not getting fired. A foreman in a Russian factory worries about not being fired at. Both are pursuing self-interest, but the sanctions, what makes something in their interest, differ radically. And self-interest shouldn't be confused with narrow selfishness. Listen to what Henry David Thoreau wrote in Walden. He says it far more eloquently than I ever could. There is no odor so bad as that which arises from goodness tainted. If I knew for a certainty that a man was coming to my house with the conscious design of doing me good, I should run for my life. Think about that. Philanthropy is almost the only virtue which is sufficiently appreciated by mankind. Nay, it is greatly overrated, and it is our selfishness which overrates it. If anything ail a man, so that he does not perform his functions, if he have a pain in his bowels even, for that is the seat of sympathy, he forthwith sets about reforming the world, being a microcosm himself. He discovers, and it is a true discovery, and he is the man to make it, that the world has been eating green apples. To his eyes, in fact, the globe itself is a great green apple, which there is danger awful to think of, that the children of men will nibble. Before it is ripe, and straightway his drastic philanthropy seeks out the Eskimo and the Patagonian, and embraces the populous Indian and Chinese villages. That's Thoreau on the danger of do-gooders. And here's the fundamental truth. Whenever we depart from voluntary cooperation and try to do good by using force, the bad moral value of force triumphs over good intentions. This is absolutely central to what I'm saying. The essential notion of a capitalist society is voluntary cooperation, voluntary exchange. The essential notion of a socialist society is force. If the government is the master, if society is run from the center, what are you doing? Ultimately, you're ordering people what to do, and your ultimate sanction is force. Think about it even on a smaller scale. Whenever you try to do good with somebody else's money, you're committed to using force. How can you do good with someone else's money unless you first take it from them? And how do you take it? The tax collector comes, backed by the power of the state, backed ultimately by police, by guns, by the threat of imprisonment. Even when people have good motives, and let's assume they do, the resort to force corrupts everything. You all know Lord Acton's famous saying, power corrupts absolute, power corrupts absolutely. That's one reason why trying to do good through force leads to bad results. The people who start with good intentions become corrupted. And if they don't become corrupted, they're replaced by people with bad intentions who are more efficient at seizing control. But there's an even more profound reason. The greatest harm is done when power is in the hands of people absolutely persuaded of the purity of their intentions. Sincerity is a vastly overrated virtue. Heaven preserve us from sincere reformers who know what's good for you and are determined to make you do it whether you like it or not. I have no reason to doubt Lenin's intentions were good. Maybe they weren't, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt. He was completely persuaded he was right, and he was willing to use any methods for what he saw as the ultimate good. Compare Hitler and Mussolini. Mussolini was less dangerous precisely because he was a hypocrite. He didn't really believe what he said. He was in it for the game. He started as a socialist, became a fascist, was willing to be bribed by whoever paid most. That hypocrisy provided some protection against arbitrary rule. But Hitler was a sincere fanatic who believed completely in what he was doing, and he did far greater harm. Or take Ralph Nader today. I have no doubt Ralph is sincere, and that's exactly why he's so dangerous to our freedom. The decline of moral climate and the path forward in recent decades, we've seen a profound decline in moral climate. Few people would dispute this. We see it in the lack of civility, in the resort to chance instead of arguments, in rising crime statistics, in disrespect for property, in riots like the one in New York after the blackout, in the difficulty maintaining discipline in elementary schools. Why? What's caused this decline? I submit that a major factor has been a change in philosophy, a shift from belief in individual responsibility to supposed belief in social responsibility. We've moved away from the idea that each individual is responsible for his own life and behavior. If someone doesn't behave properly, it's his responsibility, and he should be charged with it. We've moved toward the belief that society is responsible. If you adopt the view that everything belongs to society, then it belongs to nobody. Why should anyone respect property if it belongs to everybody? If no one is responsible for his own behavior because society is responsible, why should he try to behave well? Now, don't misunderstand me. On a scientific level, it's absolutely true that we're affected by the society we grow up in. All of us would be different if we'd grown up differently. I'm not denying the effect of social institutions on our values and opportunities, but a society that stresses individual responsibility, that emphasizes each person's accountability for himself, will have a far higher moral climate than one that denies individual responsibility. And notice the schizophrenia and talk about social responsibility. There's always a tendency to excuse people regarded as victims from any responsibility. They didn't riot because they were irresponsible. No, society made them do it. But nobody ever turns it around. If the rioters are innocent because society made them do it, aren't the alleged oppressors also free of guilt? Do you hear these same people say, we mustn't blame those who trampled the poor because society forced them to do it? Of course not. If you use the doctrine of social responsibility, you must be even-handed. It excuses both the victim and the victimizer, or it excuses neither. There's another reason for declining moral climate, and here I return to my discipline of economics. There's a fundamental economic law never yet contradicted. If you pay more for something, you'll get more of it. We've made immoral behavior far more profitable. We've established greater incentives for people to behave in ways most of us regard as immoral. Let me give you an example. In the 18th century, Britain was regarded as a nation of smugglers, lawbreakers, people with no respect for authority. By the 19th century, Britain had a reputation as the most law-abiding country in the world, with an incorruptible civil service. How did this transformation happen? Very simply, by adopting laissez-faire policies that eliminated laws to break. With complete free trade after abolition of the Corn Laws, there was no more smuggling. You could bring anything into the country. Without licenses needed to start businesses, what was there to bribe civil servants for? They became incorruptible because there was nothing to bribe them for. But watch what's happened as Britain has moved toward a more controlled, centralized economy in recent decades. That reputation for law-abiding behavior is disappearing. You have scandals about ministers, members of parliament, civil servants being bribed, rising gang warfare. Why? Because there are more laws to break. And more fundamentally, When laws don't correspond to what people regard as right and valid, they lose moral force. Does anyone here feel it's immoral to speed? Maybe you fear getting caught, but do you feel it's morally wrong? I've never found anyone who regards violating foreign exchange regulations as immoral. People who would never steal from a neighbor have no hesitation manipulating tax returns to reduce taxes by thousands. Why? Because one set of laws has moral value people recognize, the other doesn't appeal to people's moral instincts. Look at prohibition. It had disastrous effects on law obedience and morality. Something legal became illegal, and you converted law-abiding citizens into bootleggers. Or consider cigarette taxes today. New York State's tax is far higher than South Carolina's, so people buy cigarettes in South Carolina, smuggle them into New York, forge tax stamps, and sell them publicly. A large fraction of cigarettes sold in New York are bootlegged. You've provided an incentive to break the law, so people break it. Now let me bring this all home to the essence of capitalism and its relevance to humanity. The essence of a pure capitalist system is cooperation without compulsion, voluntary exchange, free enterprise. Now I hasten to add, no actual system is pure. We're always dealing with approximations, with more or less. Every real system has impediments to voluntary exchange. But the essential character of capitalism is voluntary exchange, you and I agreeing on terms mutually beneficial to both of us. This was Adam Smith's great insight in The Wealth of Nations, that individuals separately pursuing their own self-interest could promote social interest through voluntary exchange based on mutual benefit. And, this is crucial, this notion extends far beyond narrow economic matters. Consider language, English, developed with no central authority dictating rules, no planning board determining grammar. Language grew through free markets, through voluntary cooperation. You used a word, I used a word. If it proved mutually beneficial, we kept using it. Language grew, developed, expanded through free exchange. Or consider common law, not legislative law, but common law that arose from people voluntarily going to courts to adjudicate disputes. The entire body of common law developed without central planning. How did scientific knowledge arise? Not through government agencies deciding what to study. Science developed through free market exchange. Scientists voluntarily reading each other's work, taking what proved useful, discarding what didn't, building increasingly sophisticated understanding through voluntary cooperation or voluntary charitable activity. Go back to 19th century America when we had the closest approximation to a capitalist society imaginable. The federal government spent about 3% of national income, mostly on military. State and local governments spent 6 or 7%, mostly on schools. Very little welfare activity. Yet this period saw the greatest burst of voluntary charitable activity in history. Cornell was established in the 1860s by private benefaction. The University of Chicago was founded in 1890 through voluntary philanthropy. This era saw the emergence of countless private colleges, nonprofit hospitals, foreign missions, the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the Boy Scouts, Carnegie Libraries, free public libraries, voluntary cooperation proved far more effective for charitable purposes than any other method. What's the common element in all these cases? Language, common law, scientific knowledge, charitable activity, development of elaborate, complex structures without central planning and without coercion. You get progress through harmony rather than attempts to impose progress through coercion. Capitalism is often reproached as materialistic, as putting money first. But look at the facts. Money isn't the noblest motive, I'll grant you, but it's cleaner than most. Who has produced the great achievements of mankind? Can you name a great play written by a government committee? An invention produced by a government bureau? The great works, the magnificent achievements of human civilization have all been achievements of individuals. Shakespeare, George Bernard Shaw, who called himself a socialist, but whose career brilliantly demonstrates the virtues of the capitalist system he opposed. In science, it's Einstein, Copernicus, Galileo, not government agencies, but individuals, often working despite government opposition. In charity, Florence Nightingale wasn't a government employee. She was a private individual pursuing what she held dear, pursuing her self-interest. The plain fact is that in any society, whatever its organization, People interested primarily in non-material values are a small minority, and the most materialistic societies today are the collectivist ones. Russia, China, Yugoslavia. They put all stress on materialism, on economic goals and 5-year plans that destroy non-materialistic achievements. Why? Because they can suppress minorities. What we need for a humane society that allows great human achievements is a society where that small minority, interested in non-materialistic goals, has maximum freedom. And the only society anyone has discovered that comes close is a capitalist society. When people object to capitalism, examine their objections carefully. You'll find most are objecting to freedom itself. They object that the market gives people what people want instead of what the objector thinks they ought to want. This is true whether it's Galbraith, Nader, Marx, Engels, or Lenin objecting. In a free market society, it's hard to do good. You have to persuade people, and nothing is harder. But, and this is crucial, in such a society, it's also hard to do harm. True, if you concentrated power in an angel's hands, he might do much good. But one person's good is another's bad. The great virtue of a market capitalist society is that by preventing concentration of power, it prevents the kind of enormous harm that concentrated power can inflict. So I conclude, capitalism per se is neither humane nor inhumane. Socialism per se is neither humane nor inhumane. But capitalism gives much freer rein to the more humane values of human beings. It develops a climate more favorable to moral responsibility and to greater achievements in every realm of human understanding. My friends, the choice before us isn't between a perfect system and an imperfect one. It's between a system that respects human dignity, that treats individuals as free moral agents capable of making their own choices, and systems that treat people as clay to be molded by those who claim to know better. The choice is between voluntary cooperation and coercion, between persuasion and force, between respect for the individual and subordination to the collective. I've spent my entire professional life, over 4 decades now, studying economic systems, and I can tell you, with absolute conviction, the greatest threats to human dignity and freedom have always come from those with the sincerest intentions and the greatest certainty of their own righteousness. The road to oppression is paved with good intentions backed by the power of the state. So what can you do? First, understand that freedom and responsibility are inseparable. Every time you hear someone argue for transferring responsibility from individuals to society, recognize it for what it is, an argument for concentrating power in the hands of those who claim to speak for society. Second, judge systems by their results, not their intentions. Don't ask what proponents promise, ask what they deliver. Third, defend voluntary cooperation and free exchange in all areas of life, economic, intellectual, charitable. The principle is the same whether you're trading goods, ideas, or compassion. The battle for freedom is never won permanently. Each generation must fight it anew. But understand this, the system that best preserves human dignity, that best allows human flourishing, that best protects the weak from the powerful, is the system of voluntary cooperation we call capitalism. Not because it's perfect, it isn't. Not because it solves all problems, it doesn't. But because it recognizes a fundamental truth, that each human being has inherent dignity and the right to pursue his own vision of the good life, limited only by respect for the equal rights of others. Stand up for freedom. Defend voluntary cooperation. Respect human dignity. And never, ever let anyone convince you that giving up freedom will somehow make you more free, that concentrating power will somehow protect you from power, or that the path to human dignity runs through treating humans as objects to be manipulated rather than individuals to be respected. The choice is yours and the time is now. What will you choose? Thank you.